So that's where we're going. And we'll do it a couple of ways. And so what I draw on the board is now in my next slide, and we'll go over the slide. And I don't think I'm going to do that. So now we can do this as a discrete approximation and see if we get pretty much the right answer. So I've written down profits. It's price times quantity minus costs, right? And I want to take a look and see where profits are increasing and profits are decreasing. So I just literally write out, I've done it in the backwards way first. Suppose I have Q star, and I think that's a good place. I want to know if I made a little less, what would happen to profits? So profits at Q star minus 1 minus profits at Q star. And you can literally write it out. Profits are price times quantity. Here, quantity is Q star minus 1, minus costs at Q star minus 1, right? Minus profits at Q star. As usual, where we are looking at costs not at Q star, but at Q star plus or minus 1, we're going to approximate with marginal costs. And so, first we just group the terms, right? We have a PQ, so they can go away. And that leaves us a minus 1 times the P, minus P. It leaves us with this C of Q minus 1 with its minus sign, and it leaves us with a minus minus C of Q, and that's how we get to this line. And that indeed is a leading minus sign. And now I can rearrange this. This is 1 greater, Q is 1 greater than Q minus 1. So what's the difference between them definitionally? It is marginal cost, it's minus marginal cost. Right? And so making 1 less is a good thing to do if marginal cost is greater than P. It's a bad thing to do otherwise. Right? And you can do the same thing on the other side. We have to make 1 more unit, and the answer is it's a good thing to do if price is greater than marginal cost. And that's the algebra. We can talk it through too. If you sell 1 more unit, what do you get paid? I sell 1 candy bar. What do I get for it? Or 1 cup of coffee? What does the consumer give me? The price, right? Yeah, you agree with that? Sell 1 more thing, you get the price. What does it cost you to make 1 more thing? Marginal cost by definition. So if the price is bigger than marginal cost, is this a good deal? Yes. If it's less, is it a good deal? No. But if it's less, is making 1 less a good deal? Yes, I give up the price, which is the small number, and I get back the marginal cost, which is now the big number. So I'm going to make more or less until what happens? Yeah, until they're equal. That's exactly what happens. And so that's the proof that price equals marginal cost. And you can do it, if you had to do it on exam, well, blah, blah, blah. But if you had to do it on exam, you'd do it this way. You'd say, look, here's a marginal cost curve. Here's price. Let me show you that there are only 3 cases, and 2 of them I can show you are wrong. Very nice type proof. Right? There's 3 bears. Too big, too small, and just right. If I get rid of too big and too small, then I have an ugly proof by contradiction that just right is the right answer. Then you just talk it through. You say, look, out here, the cost of producing another item is bigger than the price, so you're going to put out more money than's going in, so you have less money left over, so your profits will go up if you make less, right? I would give up P, a small number, and not have to pay MC, a big number. Making less is a good idea. Over here, if I sold another unit, I would get P. I only have to pay MC to make it. I have money left over. That adds to my profits. So I'd want to go this way. So this isn't right. This isn't right. That's the only right answer. Price equals marginal cost. That's how I do it if I had to do it on an Econ 1 exam. For those of you who know the calculus, you would get a tight proof in 1 second, would you not? What would you do? You would say, what is profit? Let me see if I got it. No. Oh, I'm lucky. I've come to where I need to be. I can do other stuff. Oh, come on, thingy. What was that all about? Wow. All right, that never happened before. On the other hand, it was our last slide, so we'll just go to the board for a bit. So look, profits is a function of quantity, price times quantity minus cost of quantity. If I were looking for an interior maximum, what would I do? What do you do to find the interior maximum for a function? Take the derivative, which is P minus the derivative of cost, which is known as, yeah? And so if you're willing to do that, you can do it that way. But it won't explain to you why it works. The other has the advantage that you might see what was going on. Please wait. All right, I'm waiting. They'll teach me to install updates. Yes. Although I don't know what else. I know where I want to go. I want to read some stuff. We'll go back and try again. So, do you have any question on why average cost curves that have non-zero fixed costs end up U-shaped, or why price equals marginal cost if you're going to make anything at all? Those are our 2 facts. It's covered from an unexpected shutdown. My, how would such a thing happen? You can see if blah, 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 blah. What I want to do is I now want to go back and pick up the Clean Air Act. But to do that, I have to have this thing behave. Or, come on, behave, behave, behave. Yeah, let's go. Behavior time. So the Clean Air Act is the quintessential piece of environmental legislation. Before the Clean Air Act is the California Clean Air Act. So the U.S. Clean Air Act amendments of, I think it's 1970, are not something that just got invented and no one ever tried it before. Actually, it was done out here first. And that has some consequences for how the Clean Air Act works. I view the Clean Air Act as having 5 parts. That's probably not the way an environmental lawyer would view it. They would tell you it has many different sections and what each section does. And I'm clearly taking an economist's point of view about what does this thing really do. All right, let's see if we can go through this entire thing again. You know, some days it just doesn't want to. Come on. Come play with this thing and I'll talk. Let's see if you can't make it behave. We're looking for the Clean Air Act. So the first air bears. No, if they're already downloaded, I'd be fine. If they are downloaded, I won't be able to find them. So the way you regulate air, so the starting point is National Ambient Air Quality Standards, right? So our story was there's public health. Public health results in standards for the air, not for firms, for the air. Then there are a number of ways of making it so. We described one of them, and that is that there's a permit system. So if you are a new source, then, oh, wow, she's there. Oh, good. No, that's fine. That's it. That's all we need. Yes, thank you. Okay, so you have the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and the standards are met by the EPA itself imposing standards on new sources. If you were to build a new power plant, a new paper mill, whatever, today, then they would hold you to an effluent standard based upon technology. Those were the technology-based effluent standards we discussed. A second piece of that same story is the states could also, and in California, will also regulate you. So you'd find as you go to build your new plant that you are responsible to the US EPA, you're also responsible to the California EPA, and they may set stricter standards. In California, they will. So those are your fixed sources like a power plant. And the way in which the states do this is they write a plan called the State Implementation Plan, and they write in their State Implementation Plan quite literally how they are going to meet the air quality standards, and their answer may be all refineries will be held to emissions of whatever, half of what the TDS standards would have been from US EPA. So now you're regulated by both. In California, where the air is dirty, the local regulation is probably more stringent. They take this plan, they send it to the US EPA agrees with it, and the plants have to do it. And so that's roughly how you take care of criteria pollutants, NOx, SOx, reactive organics. So that's your new source performance standards and your state implementation plan. The next piece of it is hazardous air pollutions like radiation. Those are more tightly regulated, and typically it's US EPA that's doing the regulation. So California does not, to the best of my knowledge, have a stricter standard than the US EPA does for release of radiation. It's already quite strict. At one point I helped start a campus, and one of our giant questions in starting UC Merced was, how would our early researchers be able to do research? Because they would need a radiation permit to cover them. And how would we get a radiation permit? What we actually did is we got EPA to agree that for the purposes of radiation, if I recall correctly, we were part of Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And so we used their supervisory structure in the beginning to cover our radiation. Right? But it's a big deal to go out there and get the permits you need for hazardous air pollutions. Next piece is mobile sources. Cars are mobile sources. Mobile sources were originally thought to be things that would go everywhere in the United States, and so you wouldn't want states to be sitting on top of them. So power plants sit in states. States had always regulated power plants, places like California stringently, places like Ohio, not so much, places like Texas, you got to be kidding. And after the Clean Air Act amendments, all of those places came under the federal standard for new sources and the big fights that you'll find documented on the website as to whether or not power plants were or were not new sources. And then they were also subject to state regulation. The thought was cars and trucks and trains and airplanes and boats and all that kind of stuff would just be regulated by the feds, with one exception, California. The reason why was in the 1960s, we already had enough people in Los Angeles and enough cars in Los Angeles, so Los Angeles was unlivable without regulation on cars. That's not true for the other places in the U.S., or at least they didn't feel it was that way. Now, L.A. is hotter. L.A. has mountains, right, which trap the pollution, and so L.A. really was different. California regulated cars before anyone else did. So when they wrote the law, they said two things can regulate cars: California and the federal government, and nobody else. Because we already had, and they didn't want to take back our regulation. They could have, but they didn't want to do it. It would not have been popular. That means that if California passes a regulation about cars, for instance, we have regulations on how much greenhouse gases cars can emit, then any other state can adopt our regulations. So no other state can move first. So even if Vermont is greener than California, they cannot do it, and we can. And we did. And as soon as we did regulations on cars and greenhouse gases, the other states you think would follow suit, Massachusetts, Vermont, Rhode Island, New York are the ones I know best, but there were many others, followed suit and put in our car regulations rather than the federal ones. So that's how car regulations work. And that's mobile sources. They're done differently. The last major part is acid rain. Acid rain started out, really, it's the understanding of it started out in Europe. The English produce vast amounts of coal-fired this and that. The coal has sulfur oxides in it, nitrogen oxides in it. It produces acid rain. A key fact about Britain versus Scandinavia is the White Cliffs of Dover. Anyone know what the White Cliffs of Dover are? Yes? No? What? What are they? Yeah, and they're white. It's key that they're white. What would they be made out of if they were white? Limestone. And what happens if you put acid on limestone? The limestone, right? But what happens to the acid? It deteriorates the acid, too. Yeah? So if you have a place that's full of limestone and you drop acid rain on it, nothing happens. Well, all right, the cliffs will be eaten away eventually. But the first approximation, nothing happens. So in Britain, you produce the acid rain, and there are no effects. When you move to Scandinavia, a little north, not much north actually, but a little north, or to in Finland, places like that, there's no limestone. And so what happens when the acid hits a lake? And what happens to plants? And what happens to trees? And so the first thing that happens is acid rain is killing things in Scandinavia, and it's being produced in Great Britain. That's hard to figure out. I mean, the way I told the story, it's obvious, guys, but it wasn't obvious. And so it wasn't clear what was killing the plant life in Scandinavia. It took a while to work backwards. It was coal-fired power plants, and they were upwind in Britain. Right, so that's acid rain. Acid rain also happens in the U.S., and I guess it depends upon what your local soil is like for how much problems you have and where you live. So the Midwest blows onto the Northeast. The coal gets burned in the Midwest. So I would look to Vermont and places like that for damage. And I imagine that's where you found it. So the original way to regulate coal was an input requirement. And that, no, sorry, was a emissions per unit input. You had to take out 95% of the sulfur in the coal. That's politically wonderful because the coal that we were mining was in Pennsylvania, and taking the sulfur out of the hard coal in Pennsylvania, where there's a lot of sulfur to take out, was not harder than importing coal that had low sulfur in it to begin with. So it worked to keep the miners in Pennsylvania alive, but it did not clean up the air. When it came time to clean up the air, basically the economics community, Rob Stavins in particular, were instrumental in getting a trading program going. So power plants got permits for emissions of sulfur and could trade those permits among the power plants. And that was the acid rain trading program. And that's different from all the other things that we discussed. All the other pieces of that legislation, what do? They tell you these are your effluent permits. You may put out so much and no more. And that's specific to your plant. The acid rain trading program is you don't necessarily have to clean up. You can buy permits from somebody else. Somebody else might be cheaper at cleaning up than you are. And so it should be cheaper overall, and the amount of acid rain the amount of sulfur in the air should stay constant. And in that sense, the acid rain trading program is a break from all of the previous pollution control, which is all based on a permit world. So that's the story of the Clean Air Act. And there's a little bit more story in the sense of how far California pushed things. So the original Clean Air Act mentions climate change by name. So we didn't invent climate change. Like, we've known about climate change since 1890-something. There must be people giving better sight than that. A lot of work done in the 1950s, 60s by people like Roger Revelle, who was the founder of UC San Diego. Right? This is not a new thing. When it came time to write the Clean Air Act, they wrote it in. Nobody took advantage of that until California decided it wanted to. Why us? I mean, how many people in this room believe there's man-made climate change? All right. And if I went out to other places in California, would I get kind of similar answers? Maybe not that strongly. And if I went to Augusta, Georgia, would I get the same answer? Okay, so there's something about being out here that makes you much more open to the whole idea of air pollution and climate change. I think the story really is something like we had really terrible air, and the automobile industry denied the existence of photochemical smog for a decade or 2 decades or something like that. It's just a replay of the same thing you've seen in your lifetime. Okay, so the air is a little dark, but that's actually not something that's man-made. That's something that was natural in the Los Angeles basin. Well, it didn't happen before. There were a lot of us here with cars. Yeah, but it's natural right now, and so on and so forth. The Stanford Research Institute, if memory serves, was the primary source of disinformation. So you could go and check that out, and if I'm really correct about that, you can blame the farm for putting off air regulation in California for a while. But the reality was just too grim, and photochemical smog became understandable, and people believe in it. And my guess is, therefore, when the next air pollution thing came along, instead of basic denial, the Californians were, yeah, we know the science about that. We've been hearing about that for a while. Yeah, that's probably right. And when our government said, let's do something about it, instead of it being, Democrats want to pass AB 32, a nasty Republican governor resists, what actually happened? Do we have a nasty Republican governor who resisted? What happened? What did Arnold Schwarzenegger do? He put his arms all over it and said, climate change is bad and we Californians are going to stop it. That's what he did, which tells you how politically different we are. Could you imagine a Republican governor in the Midwest deciding that this was the thing to do, embrace climate change? I just can't imagine it. So we're all on one page. And we won't talk about the South. We're beating up on the Midwest today. So how did we do it? We knew that climate change was mentioned in the Clean Air Act, and we knew what steps we had to take to regulate, in this case, automobiles under the Clean Air Act. And we had a hearing. I actually got to go to the hearing and played a very small bit part in all of this, maybe an important one, but a tiny one. And indeed, people came up in the hearing and they said, climate change, is real. Climate change affects California differently because we want to regulate. So it can't be we're the same as everyone else. We have to be different. That's part of the deal. We have more coastline, we're hotter, and whatever the other reasons were. And then it's bad for people. It affects public health. And so we're going to claim it creates flooding. That's a bad thing. Higher temperatures lead to more deaths. That's a bad thing. And so on and so forth. And now we've set it up. And then, quite literally, so automobiles emit gases that cause climate change. We're entitled to regulate those gases. And then the automotive engineers, like I told you, held up literal things like this big, showing pieces of cars that you could change that would make cars put out less gases that lead to climate change. And that was basically what the hearing was. And at some point, the board voted to adopt what we think of as the Pavely 1 requirements, which changed the amount of greenhouse gases that California cars could emit. And then the other states I mentioned immediately went along with us. And then we had a court case, which got held probably in Vermont. And so I got to spend a week in Burlington, Vermont. And the whole thing was replayed before a federal judge.